I wouldn't say Japan's politically a disaster. In fact, socially, it's a very cohesive country. Japanese investors would be actually repatriating capital home and started looking at these things. They were profitable. Bank of Japan's a disaster. Countries can go to war and it doesn't necessarily negatively affect some of the sectors. In fact, it can positively affect them.
The risks for Greece and Japan, China opportunities. Could you revisit the risks in the themes of Greece and Japan? It seems like Japan is a basket case domestically, politically, and BOJ is a disaster. I get that private assets should do best there, but aren't a lot of their corporations really just growing their international revenue via depreciating currency and not actually expanding their business? There's also the risk of war there with North Korea shooting missiles over the island. As far as Greece, I agree with the points that you've laid out. However, it seems there's potential for a confrontation with their ages-old rival/enemy Turkey. Would just like to know your thought process here. Also, what if they close financial markets in these countries in order to avoid capital fleeing? Would our money/investments be stuck there? Obviously, the GREC ETF is domiciled in New York City, but would have to trust they will handle the situation correctly. Number two, it's clear that Asia/China is the future for the financial world, but it seems they have some growing pains to get through themselves over the next 10 years or so in order for that to happen. What are the firm's thoughts about how to take advantage of that shift? Are you just sitting tight for now? What would you be looking for to trigger a possible investment there? How does your firm look at opportunities years in advance, even if nothing is attractive right now? And that's from Michael.
Question number one is a whole lot to unpack here. Japan. I wouldn't say Japan's politically a disaster. In fact, socially, it's a very cohesive country. Rule of law is certainly, now that rule of law is collapsing everywhere else, is actually relatively good. Bank of Japan's a disaster, but the same could be said of pretty much any central bank around the world. The private assets, the private companies there are not only doing well as a consequence of depreciating currency. Remember, when we started looking at these things, they were profitable and at cheap valuations, despite and with no need for currency depreciation to allow them for margin expansion. But that's the important part. And that's as a consequence largely of this long bond bull market, whereby equities, at least in Japan, have been kind of left for dead. So they're kind of two separate things. And the other one is that Japan has a massive hoard of savings. And if that savings gets afraid in the currency markets, it has to go somewhere. And typically scared capital in Japan has looked for or invested into equity markets outside of Japan, in the US, even Australia, places like that. If you look at what the world's looking like today, it's like increasingly that arbitrage isn't quite as sexy. Certainly your average Japanese person that's now looking at Britain might be like, hang on a second, why would I invest there? Or Europe, or even America, which is going through its own political upheavals. So on a relative basis, Japan actually looks much safer. It makes a lot of sense why Japanese investors would be actually repatriating capital home and then keeping it at home in Japanese banks and or putting it into a market. Now, then you basically got bond market or equity market. Equity market is far cheaper. Bond market looks like it's in trouble. That's a pretty easy trade. With respect to North Korea or any risks like that, frankly, the whole world looks like that right now. Some places will look better than others, but by and large, that's, I think, a position sizing risk. There's always a risk that Japan could go to war. I don't necessarily see it at this point, but there's certainly more, conflict that looks like it's ramping up to some degree. The same is true with Greece and Turkey. Nothing on the horizon just yet, but we know that these old grudges have been held, and certainly now with the rhetoric between Turkey and Israel largely dominating and controlling the West via various mechanisms, you could make that argument that there could be some hornet's nests poked there. But again, the thing with risk is you can't eliminate it, you can only manage it. If you're invested in Greece and you got a big weighting and you think that's a big problem, then just reduce some of your weighting. Component is like countries can go to war and it doesn't necessarily negatively affect some of the sectors. In fact, it can positively affect them. Take Russia, for example. It's at war. They've gone to war and they're being sanctioned. And if you look on the Moscow exchange, those are our best positions we've had bar none. I know we've kind of gotten zeroed out on our accounts. Point is that those companies are extraordinarily profitable. They're doing better than they've ever done before. So in war, people don't want to own bonds. They want to own stuff. And typically we're buying stuff, so that comes back into the sectors that we buy as well. Wars are almost always inflationary or stagflationary. In that environment, you don't want to be owning bonds, you'd rather be owning equities. Asia, China. We talked about how we think China's representing quite a bit of value. We look at all sorts of stuff. I read like all the time. And so there's things that are on your horizon and you'll keep them there and you might do nothing with them for 5-10 years or whatever. You sit and wait. Most of the time you're sitting and waiting and just researching. So nothing that we're doing at this point in time. But again, your major trends unfolding are a collapse in the debt system, the Western monetary-based debt system. Got a lot of issues with it. And it's also now causing other countries to look for alternatives in the markets to facilitate trade, for them to hold positions, you name it. So, but I think like in broadly, the answer to your question is actually position sizing, because you're worried about all these different things. You go after things that have asymmetry and then you position size to manage the risk.